Amrita, Hanjrah, and Sheila Shankar are here with us, and I will turn it over to them, and we will hear their fantastic presentation. Welcome.
Thank you, David. I'm just gonna share the presentation. All right. Moving things around. All right. Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us this morning. Just wanted to make a note that I hope you and those that you care for are doing well and are safe. So Sheila and I today are going to be talking about our passion for visitation work and discussing our point of view of how supervised visitation work can be used to facilitate healing and change for families experiencing intimate partner violence. So on that note, we will be talking about family violence, and both Sheila and I are in the space of intimate partner violence on a daily basis through our work. So we want to be mindful of everyone who's listening in. So if you need to be kind to yourself, step away. We fully support that. We totally understand that. And so once again, just thankful and grateful to be with you all today.
Yeah, so can everyone hear me okay? Yeah, okay, great. So just a brief overview of what we're going to be talking about. So first we'll introduce ourselves and inspire action, and then go through a brief overview of what supervised visitation actually is, how it came to be, and why it matters. And then we'll talk more about Inspire's approach to facilitating healing and change using some stories and talking through some of our strategies. And then we'll wrap up talking about the challenges of this work and how that's related to a new project that Loyola is working on that's funded through the Office of Violence Against Women to create a new supervised visitation center here in Chicago.
So a little bit of introduction about who we are. My name is Amrita Hanjrah, and I'm originally from Toronto, Canada, but I've been in the US for a long time now, about 13 years. I came here for studying and got married and have a child, and so my life is here, and now I live in Hyde Park, Chicago. But my experience has been working with marginalized populations here in Chicago and in Toronto. And in particularly, I think my experience and passion for this visitation work came from working at Afnagar. Afnagar is a culturally specific domestic violence agency here located in Chicago for about 30 years. And, part of doing orders of protection, legal advocacy, shelter programming, one thing that I think what was really unique about this agency was they had a supervised visitation program. And a lot of domestic violence agencies don't really have services for when survivors need to navigate the needs of their children. And how are we going to sort of figure that out with them? How are we going to partner with them, with the person who's used violence in their lives? But we know that providing some sort of access can increase their safety, can heal the relationship between children and parents who have used violence. And so part of that experience, I got to be exposed to good folks here in Chicago through the Family Court Enhancement Project. Many of them are, here with us today, and sort of bringing this service of visitation and custody and visitation issues sort of into the domestic violence world as well. And then now I'm part of Inspire Action full-time for about a year and been doing consulting work with them previously. And I'll stop there. Sheila, you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, hey everyone, I'm Sheila. I use she and her pronouns, and I'm a PhD student right now at the University of Chicago in their social work program, focusing on gender-based violence and restorative justice. And yeah, similar to Amrita, I came to this work primarily through Upnagar. And prior to that, I was working in Philadelphia and had some experience doing like feminist activism in communities. But when I moved to Chicago, I got a job at Upnagar through Amrita, and she was my supervisor. And that was my first exposure to the work of domestic violence agencies, working with the court system, working with systems. And I like really understood the importance of supervised visitation and how it's one of the few programs that works with the entire family. And you have the opportunity to engage with parents and children and do this sort of transformative work. And so when I had the opportunity to do a field placement through my graduate program this year, I was like, Inspire Action makes total sense. And it would be an opportunity to keep thinking about this work and grow. So that's how I got here.
Thank you. All right, so a little bit about Inspire Action for Social Change. So the co-founders are Beth McNamara and Jennifer Rose, and they founded this agency in 2008. And I was thinking of, even when presenting this, I really want to share sort of what makes Inspire Action. Yes, there's the logistical pieces that we are funded by the Office on Violence Against Women as a targeted technical assistance providers for all justice for families supervised visitation programs across the country. And also with travel grantee programs, but Inspire Action will also continue to support and help those that aren't funded through the Office on Violence Against Women, because we know this work can be really done sometimes in isolation. Sometimes the support of other social system players isn't there. And so I think I just want to share a little bit about what Inspire is and what makes us who we are. And so here are some of our tenets: our culture of care, healing and change, holding humanity, care and compassion, transparency, and spaciousness. And this really underpins the philosophy of our technical assistance and what we hope to achieve with families that are impacted by violence. And so, for instance, we hold these values for parents who have been harmed, for parents who have used harm, and to the children impacted by violence. And as much as we hold these values for those families, we also hold them for the staff, for people who are working with families, because we know so much about secondary and vicarious trauma, and that these tenets have to be just as important for those that are helping the helper or helping those in need help. And so, for instance, we, in our approach, to create a culture of care. And what that means is by shifting our priority to caring for one another, investing in staff, taking the time to slow things down, building one-on-one relationships, and sort of shifting this social service that's been born out of child welfare into a social justice culture of care, by advocating for the elimination of the power dynamic between those that we help and the helper. Sometimes there's too much sort of policing or power in the social system services. And so another example of our tenet is we value spaciousness. And what does that mean, right? So things are just moving faster. Technology, we're far more available even now with remote access, that sometimes we're just always on demand. And we expect that from families and from staff and from one another. But we want to slow down. We need to check our biases, our assumptions, and in each interaction that we have with each other, that we have with families, that we're not sort of coming from this reactive place, but rather that we've created enough spaciousness. And that means the way that we're scheduling families, the way that, are we having enough staff meetings? Are we taking the time to schedule reading and exposing ourselves to new things that are out there, so that we can act on our truth and be genuine and authentic in each of our actions? And lastly, I think this is like one that we always talk about. So if you've been to other Inspire trainings or talks, you'll hear us talk about care and compassion. And this really exists once again, for everyone that we interact with. Supervised visitation programs can have a powerful impact on their communities in creating a space of healing and change, because each staff member that is building a relationship with all three members of the family, the children, the parent who used harm, the parent experienced harm, it's a catalyst, it's an effect that can have on the rest of the community. And once again, we're seeing more and more intimate partner violence being discussed as, it's a public health issue, it's a community issue, it's not a private issue. And so we need to sort of support in creating a community model of care. And so we thought it'd be helpful to share a little bit about, supervised visitation and the context and the timeline of, when did the service come into play in the social service arena. And so in the 1970s and 60s, when there was so much grassroots movement happening in the country, it was a survivor-led effort to address visitation and custody with families experiencing intimate partner violence. I'm sure there's some people on this call right now that could actually really speak to this. I wish I was part of that decade, but I wasn't. But I think, just one story I want to share is from our experience at Upnagar, and hearing from women who had worked there 30 years ago that their visitation program was volunteer run. And I think now to see how sort of formalized it's become, it's honestly a little mind blowing to think about the accountability that was created with no funding, and just really listening that survivors need a safe way to either exchange their children with this person, with the parent who's caused harm, or providing safe access, all those things sort of that really sometimes we're just so focused on getting the survivor out of the violence. But if you have children in common, you still are somewhat of a family for decades to come. So how are we going to help you navigate that? And then in 1994, we have the passage of VAWA, Violence Against Women Act, and then the Office of Violence Against Women was created in 1995. But at this time, we still really weren't touching on custody or visitation issues or sort of the impact that children were, the impact of violence on children. But then in 2000, that's when Safe Havens funding was created to address intimate partner violence and providing safe access and visitation. And this is where sort of, visitation was primarily out of the child welfare arena, really just focusing on creating a safe space for children. But there wasn't that sort of equal regard for the parent who has experienced the violence, that they also need so much support, and for the parent who's used harm. And so with that, in 2006, there were four, I think it was 2003, maybe 2006, sorry. There's 4 demonstration sites across the country to really implement this style of supervised visitation with the guiding principles framework. And so 4 of those demonstration sites were the Bay Area, the city of Chicago, city of Kent, Washington, and the state of Michigan. And so from that time, there's 3 programs that are still funded. So Apnagar, Mujeres Latinas en Acción, and Metropolitan Family Services. And at that time, there was also Branch Family Institute, and they continue to do supervised visitation, but it's not free for services, but they do have a more therapeutic lens to their work. And then lastly, Inspire Action was created by Beth McNamara and Jennifer Rose to provide a more humanistic adult child survivor-centered model. And this is because as much as the 4 demonstration sites and the guiding principles framework of, really creating equal regard for the children and for the parents who've experienced harm and fair interaction with all parties, it was hard for programs to really practice that. Like, what does that actually really look like? And that's where Inspire Action kind of came in, created this sort of nuts and bolts training of how this work should be done. And then since then, Beth and Jen it was a small little agency. They weren't working there full time, but then now, it's become a full-fledged agency. They took me on last year. And so it's really exciting to see that the government, there's community support around this service, and wanting to create this service that it goes beyond sort of just that 1 hour time that you have with families in a visit, but really looking to how can we create some social change in our communities.
Yeah, just to reiterate what Amrita was saying, supervised visitation and safe exchange is so much more than just, the interaction between a parent and a child in a safe way, or the exchanging of kids between parents. But that's what it is at its, bare minimum. But supervised visitation programs can really create a space to do so much more and really transform families. I mean, what's the difference between exchanging kids at McDonald's or a police station versus working with a supervised visitation program? Is that the supervised visitation program ideally will work to fostering improved relationships between parents and kids, and working with that parent who's used violence to take accountability for their actions and to develop empathy for their children and for the partner that they caused harm to strengthen a sense of safety and autonomy for children and for survivors, and to work on the relationship between children and survivors, and ultimately help families to create a sustainable plan for the future. Like Amrita said, families might be with the supervised visitation center for a little while, but they will need to figure out how to engage with each other in a safe way for 18 or more years. And so how can we work towards healing and change for the long term and be a support to a family? That's what supervised visitation really can be. Next slide, Amrita.
So here we want to show a little bit of the logistics of what happens with a supervised visitation family or how they end up in supervised visitation. And so, we started with the court, but even before the court, I think, one thing to point out is something has happened. Maybe something has been happening for years. Violence has been occurring in this family. And either the survivor has reached out to a domestic violence agency or they've hired a family law attorney and they've asked for restricted visitation. So part of restricted visitation, one of the options could be supervised visits or exchanges. And so this is where, and that's if, a survivor has the means to hire a family court attorney or that there is a domestic violence agency in their community that understands or even knows about this service. It's, we're very lucky, I think, here sometimes in the metropolitan area that, we have 3 agencies and that still isn't not enough. There's wait lists. It's a really, really in-demand agency. And you have communities across the country that don't have a visitation program, that are using police stations. And I mean, we all know, like, that is not the ideal space. That's not the role of a police station, right? That's not the role of a McDonald's. That's not the role of a public library. And so that's why we need visitation programs with trained staff who can really sort of interrupt the violence. And so here, when families do eventually end up in court, right? So here in Chicago, the option could be to go to the domestic violence courthouse or the domestic relations court. And I just want to point out here at the domestic violence courthouse, with the Family Court Enhancement Project funding, a federal award that was given to the city of Chicago in 2016, it was an underutilized service. We realized people were already getting orders of protection, but we weren't helping families figure out what are they going to do with their children. That part of the order of protection, we weren't really talking about that. And so there was some positions created out of that to help families in the moment when they're at the courthouse that were free services to help them determine, what route did they want? Do they want unsupervised time, supervised by a center, supervised by a family member or a community member? Really sort of figuring those pieces out for families and children. And then so at that point, the court will determine an order of custody and parenting time. And one of the centers might be listed in that order of protection or family court order plan. Then we ask that parents call the supervised visitation program to schedule. However, I do think that, so we're sort of encourages people to move beyond that. There might be parents that have mental health issues, the inability to sort of, make that first step. They might be so afraid. So sort of like loosening up the rules on how we always put so much pressure on parents to, you need to be the one that's going to call the social service. You need to be the one that's going to reach out and call up on that referral or that resource. But really, how can we partner with parents and to help them from the beginning process? And so this is, when they come to a center, we schedule that time. This is where they're going to learn about the program and what we're here to do with them. This is sort of the paperwork time, but really we call it an orientation because it's an ongoing process. A safety plan can't be just created in that moment because yes, at this point, the violence has just stopped. Lethality might be at its highest. There might be safety concerns that the survivor parent has not thought of just because of all that's happened in their lives, maybe within a month or 2 weeks or a day later, right? For some programs or for some parents. And so really, how are we going to revisit their safety plan? Safety needs change. If parents decide to, meet new people, that creates a whole other risk of safety issues. And so this is where we also at Inspire, before we weren't previously supervised visitation was not really engaging children. And if yes, we were here to protect the children, you could ask every single supervised visitation staff worker and ask them why they do this work. And they would say, it's because of the children. I want to keep children safe. But were we taking any sort of intentional effort to make that time to connect with children? A lot of times we weren't, right? So one of the best practices that we do encourage programs across the country to start orientations, create that one-on-one time with that child, create safe words, play a game, let them know that you are a safe person in their life. And that this has to be a continuous process. Sometimes staff are only interacting with children when literally they're just walking down the hallway from one parent to the next parent. And children don't communicate the way adults do, right? They're not going to have this 15-minute one-on-one conversation with you. They're going to, a teenager is going to be like, yeah, I'm fine, shrug their shoulders and move on. Or a 4-year-old might just be so distracted by a toy. Or so really it's about, the people that do this work need to have a variety set of skills, right? We need to help train people to work with those that have used harm, and all the way to getting on the floor and playing a game with the little one and developing that trust, or even learning how to hold a baby, right? There's 3-month-old babies that come to supervised visitation. And for some staff, they've never even held a baby, and that's fine, right? But how can that parent and that staff member partner together to provide a really important initial process? And I think that's where that orientation, sometimes just because of the way the social service arena has been set up, that it's just paperwork. And it was unfortunate sometimes during during the pandemic, a lot of people were doing orientations and intakes online, right? Or they're not even looking at each other, and that's going to really sort of hurt the rapport building process, the trust building process with the survivor parent, with the parent who's just harmed. And how are you going to really build a relationship with a 3-year-old over Zoom? So it's sort of important to always give space for this, right? This is where that spaciousness piece comes back into play. And we encourage programs, because some programs feel like, no, we have a wait list. We don't have time to do orientations with children. We don't have time to do this. We just need to get them in here and make this visit happen. That's where sort of Inspire can come in and help programs slow down. It's okay, it's better to take time and to do it right.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. I think that a lot of times programs feel a lot of pressure to just start families like right away, which, that makes sense, especially given parents really want to see their kids. There can be wait lists, but we want to make sure that programs are ready to start visits in a good way without having to backtrack or realize after the fact that they totally missed some really important information, or parents and kids weren't ready to start. So we want to start in a good way. And once visits start, typically they take place for an hour a week at the visitation center, or exchanges can happen multiple times a week. And during COVID, because we've had to shut down a lot of in-person interactions, some of these visits and exchanges have been taking place like on Zoom, where parents have been FaceTime or Zooming with their kids and playing games online and just checking in, or writing letters and sending photos and notes back and forth. So programs have really had to adapt, and they've done it really well during the pandemic. And then once visits start, that's always an opportunity for continued engagement between staff and families. So we recommend that staff really try to check in every week with parents and kids separately to see, how are things going in your life? Are there any resources that you might need? Do you need help with food or rent or your job? Because we know that those things create additional stress. It's also an opportunity to check in about how visits are going, if there have been any issues during visits, or if there's any way that staff can support parents and kids to foster a better relationship. Those are opportunities to check in and work through some strategies that might be useful. And then, of course, staff are also encouraged to talk with themselves through staff meetings and family consultations. This is an opportunity for everybody to be on the same page about what's going on with the family, and also to get some peer feedback, because this can be very stressful and overwhelming for staff, and a lot of unexpected things can happen. And so it's really important to never feel alone in the work, and to know that you have supports from your team, from your supervisors, and from Inspire. We offer weekly drop-in calls and other TA calls to really help with case consultation and just talking through things to make sure that people are making intentional decisions and know that they have support ultimately.
Thanks, Sheila. Yeah, and I just wanted to point out that we, at Inspire, of course, everyone generally operates within the 9 to 5 time. We're not a direct service program, but we do really say this again and again to all the grantees, to everyone, that you can call us. You can call us on the weekend when you are doing services. When you are doing services in the evening, Inspire Action can be a sounding board for you. Mm-hmm. And just this week, we had someone email us and they're like, "We're so sorry, but can you quickly meet with us in 2 hours? We, I've really sort of hairy situation coming up. And to me, I'm like, oh, 2 hours, come on, I can totally meet with you. Like, it's not, because I remember, like, doing these visits myself, sometimes, your stomach's twisting because you know that you have to have a really hard conversation with this parent, and you may not have caught that this was a battery tactic, or that this was something bad happening this last visit. You didn't know. And it's okay, right? Like, we're not mind readers. We're not here to investigate families and each word they say, but how are we going to have that hard conversation? And that's where that staff support can really come into play. And I think it's really nice at Inspire Action, when I joined the team, that we really are here for people, and we do open our, you can text us, you can chat us, you can email us, and that it's operating in a different way than a lot of formalized agencies do.
So this is just for some context. I know we've been talking a lot about supervised visitation, but what even is that? Like, where does it take place? So this is an example of what a typical supervised visitation room looks like, and where families would spend time with each other. So you can see that it's really tried to resemble a living room or a family home. We want to make it as comfortable and inviting as possible, with toys and games and a space for kids and parents to interact with each other or share a meal. And there's always a space for an advocate to be in the room. So you can see at the desk in the back there, that's where an advocate would be sitting and just watching over and being there as a support in case parents need it for any reason. I also want to just take this moment to talk about how the buildings are set up for safety. So typically, parents would arrive at 2 separate entrances when they come for visits or exchanges, and at different times, so that there's no chance that they would run into each other in the parking lot or in the building itself. So we're always trying to keep that safety piece in mind for survivor parents as well. So advocates would check in with the survivor parent and sort of transport the kids from the survivor parent to the visiting parent, and then back again, so that there's that physical separation.
Thanks, Sheila. One thing I wanted to point out was, the sort of staggered arrival and the different entrances. This has been in place since Safe Havens 2006, right? And I will say that one thing of when we were doing services, sometimes it's really hard to think that you can do things differently, that you could have a parent who's used harm come at a different time or through a different entrance, because that's actually safer for the survivor parent. So really, I think Inspire Action, what we can do is give programs, people that are actually directly working with families, the permission to change things for each family. It doesn't have to be done the same way just because maybe the foster care services in your community do everything exactly the same way, or the other supervised visitation program always uses that one entrance for the survivor parent. Sometimes that's not safe. Sometimes it is safer for that survivor parent to come to the site before the visiting parent gets there. So there's a lot of, I feel like in a way, I think Inspire, where we offer to people is this permission, this different way. You can do it differently. And you can try to do things that feel unconventional, right? And that's how we're going to move towards sort of out of this agent of social control, but to this agent of social healing. So what we're going to do is we wanted to kind of show and paint a picture of what leads a supervised visitation or what leads a family to come to supervised visitation, right? Like what happened, what's going to happen. And we'll also talk a little bit about an actual visit. Sheila, do you want me to read this story?
Yeah.
All right, this is Maya's story. I'm going to be playing the role of Maya. I come home after picking up Priya at kindergarten, and when I arrive, my mother-in-law is in the house with Raj. Raj begins yelling and berating me. He tells me that I should have left work early so I could make dinner and greet his mother. I apologize and try to explain that if I left work early, I could lose my job. Raj tells me he wants me to quit my job and that he never wanted me to work. He says we didn't come to this country so that I could be away from my children. Raj controls our bank accounts, but I know that if I didn't work, we wouldn't have money to send back to India. Finally, Raj tells me I'm a bad mother. He says that Priya needs to understand how Indian women are expected to act. He turns his attention to Priya and starts yelling at her to get her brother a drink and to start helping me prepare dinner. I tell Priya to go get changed and start her homework. Raj steps in and physically assaults me, and Priya tries to step in between us. Raj raises his hand to strike her. I step in the way, and Raj physically assaults me again. His mother jumps in and starts yelling at me, saying that I'm a bad wife and I need to take better care of her grandson and son. This infuriates Raj, and he orders me to quit my job. He continues to tell me if I do not quit my job tomorrow, he will take the children away. He threatens to kill me, and if I do not obey him. I leave Raj and his mother alone and take the kids to the kitchen. I pick up the phone, but I don't know who to call. I'm nervous that if the news gets out to our community, everyone will shun me. And I'm hesitant to call the police because we're not citizens. What will happen to our immigration status if the authorities find out about this? Will they take the kids away from me? And so, sorry if that was a little hard for everyone to hear, but a lot of moments like this happen before a family comes to supervised visitation. It could be ongoing. I know that it can take 7 to 9 times before someone decides to leave their partner who's caused violence. It can take up to 16 times for an immigrant or a woman of color to leave their partner because of immigration issues and the other interlacing factors that prevent women from leaving or men from leaving the situation. So, should I do anything? No. And so this is where self-reflection is it's a pillar of our service at Inspire Action, because we realize that when you do this work, when you are serving families and you're going to trainings and you're going to webinars, but when are you taking the time to stop, think, and reflect on your own assumptions, your biases? It's sort of how we will develop and sharpen our self-awareness skills so that when we are watching a visit, when we're interacting with parents who've used harm or survivor parents, that we can really actually hear what they're saying and not this lens of bias or what we believe is good parenting or what we would have done in that situation, right? So this is sort of something that we always practice anytime when we're with those learning or wishing to learn about supervised visitation work. And so I'm just going to read these questions out, and if everyone could just take a minute or two just to think about what comes up for you. So what comes up for you when you think of parents who have been harmed? What comes up for you for parents who use violence? And what do you think of children growing up in homes where there's violence? Thank you. And if someone wants to share, they can, but you don't have to either. So thank you for participating with us.
Yeah. So I think it's really helpful to hear that sort of story and become aware of how we automatically react, because that is what happens in the supervised visitation program. Like, as staff, you're sitting with families and you're hearing their stories, and it's very emotional. I know that a lot of people who come to this work, including myself, have personal experience with family violence, domestic violence, sexual assault. And so there isn't necessarily this notion that I'm separate from this. I'm a staff person and I'm separate from this, and this is not related to me. Because for many of us, it's deeply personal. And it can be very easy to go to a place of binaries and of thinking that one person is completely responsible for this and needs to be punished, which is very understandable, especially given the criminal justice system and the ways that the domestic violence movement has historically been very punitive and carceral. You know, it has, the domestic violence movement for sure has made great strides to recognize domestic violence and sexual assault, intimate partner violence as problems which are totally unacceptable. But we at Inspire and in especially BIPOC communities are really trying to shift away from this desire to blame and punish and incarcerate towards focusing on, well, what really are the needs of the person who is harmed. We know that punishing somebody, arresting somebody, putting somebody in jail doesn't always actually address the needs of the harmed party and transform the conditions of violence. And so we want to center on, what does the survivor need in this situation? What does the child need in this situation to feel safe? And how can we encourage a person who has caused harm to take actual accountability for their actions with the support of others? This approach really centers this idea that change is possible and change is necessary if we're going to heal and transform our society, our family, our values. And it really moves away from this idea that the problem is located in the individual, that there's something wrong with this individual who is a criminal or who has some pathology, but that violence happens for many reasons, and a lot of those reasons are structural. And so in this analysis, we're taking into consideration, what are different factors like racism or poverty or immigration status, patriarchy? What are these structural conditions that allow for violence to arise? And how can we address the structural conditions in addition to the behaviors in order to really work towards accountability and transformation? And it's really hard. You know, we're seeing these shifts happen slowly in the community with the rise of restorative and transformative justice responses, harm reduction approaches, community accountability models. But we know that there's a lot of work to do within ourselves to become aware of our own biases, the reactions that we have, and to try to work through those together in this work with families.
So this Inspire Action model of change is possible, the enhanced model. And so really this comes from the shift from monitored supervised visitation, where the monitor is sitting in the room and just watching and listening and writing everything down that's happening in this visit. They're not necessarily engaging, but they're just making sure that nothing bad happens in this visit. However, sometimes trying so hard to make sure parents don't talk about anything real in the visit, just really focus on playing or talking about light subjects, that we're not giving this family to interact in a very real way, to sometimes have those harder conversations in a visit, because it's better if it happens in a visit than it happens, 6 months when there's no one else there. And so how are we encouraging and creating spaces that are brave for parents who have used harm and for their children? And we've heard from the ACEs study that, sometimes people who have used harm towards their partner, that may not change. They may not take accountability for that. But what they can be encouraged to do and what can be motivated to do is change their behavior when they realize the impact of violence on their children. And so how can we sort of, in a supervised visitation, build on that opportunity that this parent is here together, we can partner with them, and can we, even for this child, to create maybe some positive memories, maybe there's been nothing but violence this child has been exposed to, but they get to see this parent in a different light and carry that with them. And maybe it'll go back to something unfortunate after visits end, right? But if there could be a couple of moments that a child could hold on to, and that parent could hold on to, right? Because there was some accountability in this artificial setting. We know it's an artificial setting. We know that this is not what it might be like once they leave. But what can we do in that moment, right? And so that's really what this enhanced model is. It's to, a strength-based, optimistic approach centered on the belief that change is possible. And so that belief has to reside within staff and with people who work with these families, right? And as Sheila was saying, if we come from this place where this person needs to be punished, they need to be held accountable. They've been getting away with it for so many years, and I'm here to make sure that he or she doesn't get away with it anymore. But that's not going to work. We know that doesn't work, right? We know that our prison system, these carceral systems, they don't create the change that we're looking for without sort of the supportive place. And so in this enhanced model, if we can partner with parents, we can show them that, if you partner with a community member, it may not be me, it might be someone else, it might be another agency or another resource that you need. How can you ask other people to help you? Or what can we do to show you and reveal to you your inner strengths, right? Maybe it's just been a long time of someone listening to your story, right? And that's not condoning, that's not colluding. That's, sometimes supervised visitation, families for the first time will say, I've never shared this with anyone. No one's ever heard my side of the story. I didn't even know that I was doing something wrong. Culturally, I thought it was okay. I had a mom, we have a rise of visiting moms across the country losing custody. So, there's programs here in Rockford, Illinois, where over 50% of their cases are survivor moms coming as a visiting parent. Every time I talk to a new program, they're like, oh, I just did 5 intakes for young moms losing custody and coming in because of either substance abuse issues, but not really necessarily related to the violence of why they need to be in a supervised visitation setting. So how can, as a supervised visitation worker, what can I do to partner with this parent? What goals can we set together, right? And sometimes supervised visitation staff feel nervous to engage. Sometimes social workers, we are nervous to engage with parents so deeply because like, oh, well, that's therapy. I'm not a clinician. I'm not here to, talk about that. You need to talk to a therapist, or I'm going to connect you with the local, partner abuse intervention program. But it has therapeutic value. It doesn't have to be a therapeutic supervised visitation. Therapeutic supervised visitation is very different. There is plans, there's agreements, there's a service plan for everybody involved. There's a lot more in place for when if a therapeutic supervised visitation is going to take place. So really, with this engaged model, we're just being human, honestly. Like we're just really, once again, recognizing the other person's humanity and our own, and that we're really not that different, and we know that there's a lot more families of color in supervised visitation. There's a lot more policing and a microscope on families of color. And so, what are we doing to help that or hurt that? And so these are some of the key strategies that Inspire Action has. Connect and build strong relationships with each parent. And what this means is when you have a strong relationship with each parent. So let's just say for the survivor parent, something came up in the visit and you're not sure if that was, should the child have said that? Is this creating a safety issue for this family? But if I don't have a relationship with her, and it's going to be really awkward for me, I may not want to bring it up. I may upset her because she might be like, I can't believe you let him say that to the child, right? And so as a visitation worker, you're in this tough place now, because if you set time aside each week or 15 minutes and just let them know that you are here to connect with them, to learn, so that you can safety plan in the best way possible. And also with the parent who's caused harm, right? If you're only doing the intake paperwork and you're sitting there, but you haven't made the effort to, start with the small talk, to talk about things that are outside of this visit, it's going to be really hard for when you have to intervene and say, can we talk about something else? That's not appropriate. Or if there's issues of sexual abuse allegations, I'm sorry, but you can't touch a child, right? It's going to be really awkward and really painful to bring that up, right? And to have a conversation after. So that's why we have to keep connecting and building those strong relationships. Engaging from a humanistic and compassion-driven approach. You've heard us say this a lot throughout the presentation, but really that's going to help us de-escalate situations. It's just recognizing that this is a hard space. Families are probably in the worst place of their lives when they're in a visitation. Like, who wants to be in a visit with maybe a person who's much younger than them, watching them interact between them and their child, right? It's an incredibly invasive space for a parent. And so we have to have a lot of compassion for them. And for the parent who's bringing their child and trusting us to keep them safe, so that's a lot for a parent to just drop your child off. You've maybe met me once, and now I'm going to take your kid away, and I'm going to put them in a room with someone who's caused you harm for many years. And respect the humanity and unique life circumstances of each individual. So this is where I think it'd be important to go back to Maya's story, right? Her unique life circumstances. And so there's no judgment of why she didn't leave sooner, or also sort of this cultural essentialism that we sometimes play into, that, oh, well, yeah, that community, yeah, they do that, right? They expect women to behave this way. And so sometimes our own misogynistic or our racist tendencies can't come out. They come into our brain, right? We all hold it. There's no denying it, right? So that's why we have to continuously do the self-reflection work. Realize, what I'm about to say right now, is this layered? Does this mean something else? Am I putting this policy in place because I, need to help this family and help teach them the more Western way of parenting? And that's where sort of Inspire Action has really taken this piece up in a really intentional way. We've been focusing on how programs need to engage in an anti-racist modeling of supervised visitation work. I think there's been a lot of multiculturalism and that kind of training, but really, as a social service agency, how are we perpetuating structural racism in the lives of families? Because once again, a lot more families of color are ordered to supervised visitation versus a family where a parent may want supervised visitation, but the parent who's used harm has access to resources and can afford an attorney to make sure that they're not in a visitation space. But maybe they got grandma to watch the visit, right? So really, the families that come to us, they've been kicked around so much more. And then centralize the safety of adult and survivors and counteract the experiences and tactics of family violence. And so that's sort of, once again, how can we counteract without being punitive, right? What can we say that can create some change, that can create some healing for this family? That's not going to be, I'm going to write you up. You did a violation of the visit. Though that language is so carceral and it's problematic. It creates no trust. The children are also, we have stories of where there's third generation of families in supervised visitation. So obviously this kind of monitoring clipboard in the corner method is not working.
Yes, exactly. I think if you just click the next slide, the other half will come up too. Okay. Yeah, so just building off of what Amrita was just saying, we're really trying to shift away from this like monitoring, you broke the rules model. That's not helpful, and it's very shaming, and it doesn't allow for a parent to actually like become aware of what the dynamics are and want to engage in like a co-creative process of change, because now I've done something wrong and I'm a bad parent, and that's not a place to grow from. That's a place to become smaller. So we really want to encourage staff to partner with parents, like Amrita said, and to co-create visit guidelines based off of families' unique safety needs, but also, what's good and fun for that family? Like, how can we really foster like true, positive, healthy, and happy engagement here? So that could be bringing in food from one's culture, because we know that food is such a bonding experience for families. Or if a parent is struggling to connect with their kid, maybe the staff could facilitate a game for everyone to play. So just ways to help parents and kids interact in a more genuine way. Like Amrita said earlier, of course, we want to engage with both the parents and kids during check-ins to see how things are going, offer support and resources. I want to linger on the child autonomy and choice for a second, because that one is really important. I think that a lot of times it's easy to get into a mindset of, we need to make the visit happen. There is a court order here that says that a kid needs to see their parent, so that needs to happen no matter what. But we really want to slow down in those moments and think about, is this our like adultist bias coming in? Are we just trying to make a child go to see their parent even when they don't want to? How can we get curious about why they may not want to see their parent? So if a child is expressing a lot of anxiety, or if a baby or a toddler is just screaming and crying and can't settle down before a visit, we don't need to force a visit to happen. That's an opportunity for staff to talk with that child or with the survivor parent about what might have happened before that's creating that sort of anxiety, and how can we work to support that child in maybe not seeing their parent right now, or maybe working up to seeing their parent, really trying to center a child's autonomy and choice. And that framework shift is really important, because now this child knows that this is finally a space where their voice and their body matters, that they can engage with their parent in a way that feels good and safe for them. And I think that that's really transformative for a lot of kids. And then again, like Amrita said, we really want to engage with parents who have used harm. I think that a lot of traditional and monitored approaches don't talk with parents who have caused harm visiting parents. They don't always check in with them. They don't want to know what's going on in their lives all the time, because it can be really challenging. But so countering that bias within ourselves and trying to be open, and seeing how we can support that parent in the best way. Anything else to add here, Amrita? Okay. All right, so we're just going to read a quick visitation scenario again to ground this more for you all in what the reality of the situation is, and then we're going to talk about a couple of intervention strategies. So the Gupta family, that's Maya and Raj, come in for a visit. Before the visit starts, Priya feels anxious and doesn't want to leave Maya's side. When the visit starts, Raj speaks in Hindi to the kids. He then starts to ask the kids questions about where Maya is living now, because he needs to get in contact with her to pass on important information. And while playing together, Raj ignores Priya and pressures Jay to act tough because he's the man of the house now. So that's a lot of stuff that's happening in one visit, but that's how it goes. You know, visits can be really unpredictable and a lot of things happen. We don't always know why things are happening in certain ways, and we want to be intentional about if we intervene and how we intervene. Again, not trying to punish or control or come from a place where we know what kind of parenting style is best, but really working to understand, is this safe or is this dangerous? What's really going on here? How can I interact with the family to try to like figure this out together?
And so this is sort of intervention toolbox that we have, and I'll take up the interpersonal piece. And so creating visitation guidelines based on survivor safety. So that's where we don't just have a black and white guidelines, 30 guidelines that we follow for each visit, right? But this is really, it's individualized, it's based on the survivor safety. So for instance, Maya may not have an issue with him speaking Hindi in the visit, right? But if none of the staff are able to speak Hindi, that is a safety concern, because staff need to be able to understand what is being said in this visit, right? So that's sort of, once again, or she might be like, no, please don't let him, I only want him speaking English, right? So how can what do we need to get in place? What interpreter services do we need to know? And that's where the supervised visitation program needs to have sort of strong community collaboration so that they can provide services for this family. Because across the country, you know, there's really this sort of, I think it's it's not true anymore, where it's like only, some programs, they're in the rural communities, they might say that only English is the only language that's being offered at the supervised visitation program. But because of immigration, we know that there's communities all across this country that need access to, that need language access and have a right to language access. And so as a program, really sort of diving into what does that look like? What do you need to do? What changes do you need to make? What fundraising needs to look like to really create an enhanced version of services. And so sort of continue with risk assessment and safety planning. So for instance, if I intervene as a supervised visitation monitor, am I going to create more harm for this family? Is it better if I do this after the visit? Is there a way that we can have a conversation around what just happened in this visit that would plant a seed for Raj, right? Or am I going to create, if I call him out in front of his kids, or have I lost all the rapport, all the trust building, everything that I've tried to do for this family? But then also, if I don't say anything, depending on, the kids might be like, oh, she can't keep us safe either. This monitor can't keep us safe, right? So really, there's a lot of things that might be going through your mind, but that's sort of that slow down, catch your breath, look at the children, see how they're reacting. And that's why it's so important, that check-in time, that spaciousness, that you have enough time to spend with these kids, and reality testing with the parent who's used harm, because it is the service of the domestic violence arena, supervised visitation. A lot of advocates don't have much experience of working with men who have used harm, or parents who have used harm. And so really, sometimes just like fingers crossed, hope he doesn't say anything that's going to be problematic and that I don't have to intervene. Like that is just a common desire amongst everyone who does visitation work. But then that's really going to create those really tough situations for us where, Raj he's saying that he needs to pass important information, right? But maybe before the visit, is there anything, because this is a new visit for them, they may have just separated. Is there anything that you need to share? Is there anything that you want to talk to me about? How are you feeling? How do you think the kids are going to react to when they see you? Oh, and he might be like, oh, they might be jumping up and down. They can't wait to see me, right? But we know from when we did the child orientation that these kids are dreading this visit. They really don't want to go. And so how are we going to balance that, right? What reality testing do I need to do with dad, right? So with Raj, I might say things like, I don't know if so, that's great. I'm glad that you think the kids are going to be really excited. But what if they're not? What if they're really nervous? What if, it's a new space for them? How can I help support you? Right. So just like little things like that of how we intervene, and so that can be a lot of the debriefing after a conflict or after a moment of intervention. And, I'll just give one example because this one comes up, but the survivor parent has an all organic diet, wants the children to only eat, vegan meals, and dad for the visit comes in with a bag of McDonald's. Right. And so, but we know that mom has asked, please make sure that the snacks are healthy. But that's not really a safety concern for us, right? Of why they're here at this visit. This is a parenting choice. And so sometimes, as much as we are here to help that survivor parent, this is where we can help her in a reality testing way, that this might be your reality for the next 20 years of your life, at graduation, at weddings, at funerals, that he might always want the kids to eat Twinkies and 7-Up. But you may want them to be this way, but how can we support you? How can we create space in your heart, in your head, for that you won't have control over what the children do or eat or say when they're with him, right? So how can we use a supervised visitation setting as a little, like a testing ground for those?
Yeah, exactly. And I'm going to go through these next two categories pretty quickly, but I want to start with some of the possibilities that we know that a lot of times, especially in immigrant families, it's not just the immediate family or the nuclear family, but it's the entire extended family and the community that's involved. And so it's important to think about a supervised visitation programs. Does it make sense for us to reach out to this person's extended family or community members for support? Like, how can we involve the entire community in this process if it's appropriate, rather than putting the pressure on the nuclear family to make things happen? And we also want to think more about restorative interventions. Like, is it appropriate in this context to maybe facilitate a healing circle between a parent and the child if a parent and child both express a desire and say that they're ready and they want to take this next step? Like, that's something that we could be thinking about to actually facilitate healing and change. On the flip side of that, I also don't want to shy away from talking about suspending or terminating visits. Unfortunately, that does and sometimes needs to happen if a family or a parent isn't able to respect the guidelines or boundaries of a visitation center, if they continuously do things that endanger others or themselves. Those are times that we would need to talk with that parent seriously about either putting visits on pause or terminating and referring out to a different service, because ultimately we want to do our best to make visits happen and to help this family reconnect with themselves, but we also don't want to condone danger from constantly happening. So that's an extreme situation. And then intervention can also look like, oh, sorry. Intervention can also look like advocacy. So thinking beyond the nuclear family, what sort of resources can I get this family connected with? Do they need legal assistance? Do they need help with getting food stamps or connecting with other resources in that way? Are there any mental health concerns? How can we get them connected with a therapist or a counselor? Do they need housing? So thinking about case management is also part of the supervised visitation job, that in order to help a family get to a better place, we have to think not just about their interpersonal dynamics, but also all of the structural forces that allow a person to live a healthy and fulfilling life. So that, I think, is a good segue to the next section.
Yes. So Loyola University, in partnership with the Office on Violence Against Women, has received new funding and a new award. And just to make a little plug here, Justice for Families grant funding source is the most competitive grant source under the OVW. So to get this award is a big accomplishment, and congratulations to many of those who are on this call. And so what we're hoping to do with this new award is improve court services, creating a liaison position between the domestic violence courthouse to the supervised visitation center, training judges, and sort of building that community piece of what Sheila was just mentioning, the advocacy. And then in hopes of creating a new supervised visitation and safe exchange center within Loyola or near Loyola University with MSW students. And once again, partnering with the Loyola University Law School in some legal assistance, and not in representation, but just sort of legal information, because so many parents will come to supervised visitation, they arrive at a center, and they have no idea how they even ended up here. They don't know how long they're going to be here. What are their rights? What does it look like? Am I going to be here for 13 years? Really, like, and especially with, I think, the rise of visiting moms as supervised visiting parents, the gender bias they experience, the lack of resources they already have because of patriarchy. So there's a lot of things to really help these visiting parents and survivor parents. And then in partnership with Curl to hopefully evaluate and create a supervised visitation center that is not, that is something different, that is flexible, is nimble, is different, because you have a university, right? Universities are where we get studies from, learn how to do things. There's young minds, there's professionals, there's academics, there's a lot more sort of involved here versus a standalone supervised visitation program that's been in operation for 20 years. There hasn't been any new fresh thinking injected into the policies and procedures, the really, I know for me, it's very exciting as Inspire Action to be the TA provider for this site. So I want to share that, and that I'm really excited for Loyola University.
Yeah, so I think everything that we've been talking about today we've been alluding to and sort of like just referencing this future that we're trying to build and that supervised visitation programs can be a part of. That we know that in the domestic violence movement and in the anti-violence movement generally, we're starting to see the narrative shift. You know, people are talking about abolition. People are talking about transformative justice and community accountability. And a lot of this movement work has been led by Black, Indigenous, people of color, queer and trans survivors, women. And it's exciting to see where this work is going, because we're trying to move this towards a more healing centered and restorative practice. And so I think everything that we've been talking about today is getting at what does it mean to reform these systems, but in a way that is truly survivor centered, that doesn't continue to increase surveillance and the power of the carceral state. How do we actually lean into, like, I don't know, the possibility of ourselves in this future? I think that Inspire is doing a lot of great work here, and that we're learning from a lot of people doing this work in community. And it's exciting to see where this will go. So with that said, it would be great to hear any questions or comments that you have about this work, about Inspire, supervised visitation, the new Chicago Center. Thank you very much for listening, and happy to answer any questions.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you both. This, I feel like I came in knowing a fair amount, and I have learned volumes more already. So thanks, very much appreciated. We're going to open it up to questions. We're a fairly intimate group here, a smaller group here. So go ahead and unmute yourself and raise your hand if you have a question. If you know how to raise your hand virtually on Zoom, that's fine. If not, wave the old-fashioned way, and we'll go from there.
I don't think I know everyone here.
Really, no questions? A comment you would like to make? Oh, Peyton, take it away.
Hi, I was wondering, you mentioned that there are some of the pilot programs that are still open currently. Would you mind listing again what those are?
Oh, are you asking for the Chicago area?
Yeah.
Upnagar
Okay.
is one. APNA. Yeah, I'll chat it out to you.
Excellent. Thank you.
Yeah. And hopefully Loyola University soon.
Indeed, hopefully soon.
Well, I have a question.
Fire away.
Well, I'm curious, like listening to Sheila and I talk about this, Christine, Leslie, you've been part of this work for a long time. What came up for you listening to us talk about this, the timeline of things?
So I guess what came up for me is like how we transform the culture, both of the battered women's movement and the judicial system, and sort of the how we transform that to reflect the experience. I mean, one of the things that the visitation centers and the safe exchange centers really get, this is so fascinating, but really sort of symbolize or show is the after experience of families and systems that have experienced violence. So in some ways, you really, get to the real nitty gritty problems. And so how do you transform and incorporate those lessons and really the lives of people post, I'm going to say post a
Yeah.
certain trauma or an acute situation. And that's really interesting because, yeah. And I mean, I think that that's what we're all trying to do, but it just really raised that much more in my mind. And, you know, what are the realities? And it also raised in my mind the whole, and this is a thing I talk about a lot, about the fact that the DV movement is is very the service provision is very transitory and very fragile. And when Sheila was talking about the kind of interaction and the kind of skills that people need, you really want a system that's very hardy and that people stay around with for a while, and so all of those sort of staffing questions and continuity questions just came up for me.
Thanks, Christine. Leslie, you look like you would like to jump in here.
First of all, really wonderful, guys, both of you. Well done, well done. And second of all, how excited I am about being able to do this or be a part of it. But mostly I wanted to say that this is a very telling time. And I think that all that you said about moving the movement in a different direction away from the carceral is so valid. And I wholeheartedly support that. I think the difficulty is that most of the systems have been set up around crisis and safety, and then accountability through carceral remedies, right? And that's not going to go away particularly. It might also transform, but I don't have much faith that within that environment, we can get to very much that is all that transformative in terms of ultimate behavioral change for people who have caused harm. And I've worked in that system for a long time. And I've looked at the research about what works with those who have caused harm. And the techniques that we've used have had some positives, the research show, but really not over the long term, we're not so sure. So what excites me about this is an environment in which to experiment with that to some extent. I hate to say that, it's not, we shouldn't be experimenting with people's lives, but a response that is less punitive, and then to see where the balance lies here in that, because we can't give up sort of on the progress that's been made around achieving an understanding that this is violence directed in a particular way to a particular person with some particular aspects to it that that really cannot be tolerated, right? That's not to say that we can't make change. And so, I listened to the presentation that you gave, and I wholeheartedly agree with it, but I have to say that I also get a teeny bit nervous, even though I'm totally committed to it, that we not go into this with the idea that we can repair every harm that the person who's caused harm has done, and that some of it is not repairable from him in terms of behavioral change. All of that. And I understand why you stress what you stress, because we already stressed the latter of what I'm saying, to the detriment of what we're trying to do in being more humane. And it is very interesting to me, because I won't lecture much more, but it's very interesting to me because I've been thinking about this for a while, as Amrita knows, And to have the abolition movement and other things come up simultaneously with this thinking and seeing the synergy, it didn't come out of it, but there is an absolute synergy here that must be absorbed in this moment. And I'm just excited to be a part of it, to have seen it come to this point. I almost got choked up.
I just wanted to say, Christine and Leslie, what you're saying, right? Like, how is this actually, and my personal experience has gone from a monitored to
Yes.
an engaged, engaged service, right? Because I didn't have, as a supervised visitation program, we don't have the aftercare specialists, the aftercare community partners that we need, right? So yes, we're moving towards a healing space. So for example, a lot of supervised visitation programs are like just tons and tons of donations of toys. So these spaces are really overwhelming and they freak parents out because the kids are just like going nuts in a visit, right? So even the simplest thing of let's make this feel more like a family living room, right? And just like little things like that. Or I remember a dad came in, he had 4 daughters, they came every Saturday. And when he came to see the space and he's like, it's definitely a unique situation. He's like, I've been telling my therapist, I don't know how to have a nice visit with my girls because the space, like it's like playland for them and I can't interact with them. I can't engage with them. Right. So, and then that led me to have this conversation with him, like, we're trying to create an engaged service model. Right. And he's like, oh, this is awesome. I can feel even the way you're talking to me. And then he said, I remember like, yeah, you're not acting like the B word. Okay. And I was like, oh, okay. Yeah. But like, how do we, right? Because that's where people are coming from. They're talking very in a non-academic sense, right? Like we're all here with our multiple degrees, et cetera, but a lot of just sort of this rawness that families are experiencing. And then sometimes when you're the social worker or the legal advocate coming in, and then someone's talking to you and maybe swearing or using, how do you actually hear what they're saying? Are you just so biased and uncomfortable? And that's part of, I think, once again, the carceral system and how it plays out with parents. But I think that, Christine, like what you're saying, right? Like in a hardy system, I will say for Sheila and I, it's not like I was working with people who use violence before, in law school. I was definitely pretty sheltered from a lot of things in my life, to be honest. But I think it's this personal belief system. And I think sometimes we don't allow or like let people talk more about why they're doing this work, right? What's the spiritual basis for their work? And that's sort of, I think all those conversations are going to start coming now because of this anti-racist model, that we don't have to just like cut up certain parts of ourselves when we show up at our job. But this is like, this for me, this is a spiritual conviction. This is something that I want to see the humanity in the other person, and I want them to see it in me. And that's hard though to find in everyone, right? But I think there are ways to get people like that want to do this work. And some people entered the work this way, but then over just the system crushed them a little bit. And that's, I was very lucky to cross paths with Inspire. Wow, these people really mean what they say. They practice what they preach. I want to be a part of this world, right? And I want to share that with other supervised visitation providers. Sorry, a little.
I want to jump in and just say I was really struck by so many things, but the relational, and both in your presentation, but then in this kind of conversation that you all are having, just how important that, and can be subtle, but that really big, I think it's actually a seismic shift from, you can talk about it in the carceral model of this isn't someone who, this is a unit that needs to be judged and then moved over into this system and that system. And it's, and really what you're talking about here in this enhanced model and the other things you're talking about is, and you use the phrase, relationships, building a relationship, maintaining a relationship, multiple relationships, and the relationships that they then have with not only with the visitation staff or even the relationship they have as a family unit, but on extended family and community. that is so, I mean, we use the word, but it's so critical, I think, of a shifting of what is trying to be achieved here. That's not how we generally think about, historically, about crime and punishment, about providing even, sort of a welfare state, right? Those are that relational, that seeing people as human beings. Yes, human beings caught up in systems. It's not like we're ignorant or pretend they don't exist, but we want to see them and try and establish some sort of relational interaction with them. I think it's just, it is for me, if I had to strip away everything else, that's the biggest and yet most subtle shift of what you all are trying to do. And I think, again, it's what we're seeing in other anti-racism efforts and as well. I just was struck by that. And also, within Leslie's comments and even Christine's, I also share an anxiety, like, wow, that's a lot of work. It's a lot of work. That's a lot of work. But that shouldn't be particularly surprising. I mean, this is not easily done. So
It's good trouble.
yeah, good trouble. Yes. Yeah.
But that's a really good point, David. Like, that was one of the things that was the most like, I don't know, like visceral for me when I first started the work, that ultimately at the end of the day, it's you and a dad and some kids in a room together. That is extremely intimate. Like, you can theorize about a lot of this stuff, but when it's just you and another person in the room, like, that's what it is. And so how do you start from that place? I think that's a total framework shift.
Yeah. And how does that inform and impact all the other things you're trying to do? And it's multi-layered, it's intersectional, it's complex. I would think in many ways it's confusing. There's competing, as you noted, there are competing demands, and not everything has to be handled in the same way, which when we think about other relationships that we have, we kind of intuitively get that. We may not always like it. We wish it would be, our friendships would be cleaner and more organized or whatever, but that's not who we are as human beings. And so to expect that in this particular relationship, or these relationships that we're trying to build, is unrealistic. And so you kind of, the other thing that just jumped out at me, I've got to kind of play around with it and think about it more. I haven't heard this from Inspire before. Maybe I just wasn't paying attention, but the spaciousness, wow, that's something I'm like, what? That rang that rang true in other kinds of settings, and the need for that as well. And I think when we're talking about that really fundamental shift to locate this as a relationship building, wow, the spaciousness, graciousness, if you will, for yourself and for everyone else that you're interacting and building relationships, really starts to come home. So.
And that relationship has to be built in an environment in which somebody actually has been sort of mandated there.
Oh, yeah.
It's not like there's a voluntary absorption of wanting to engage you in that relationship. And that's what I think makes it different than a typical therapeutic relationship that one tries to achieve one-on-one.
I think that's where, oh, sorry, Leslie. I was going to say that, like, I think we're seeing in communities of color that transformative justice spaces are happening without state funding, without federal funding, right? And they're not letting people know that they're doing this work, right? Because there is so much scrutiny, there is so much, even when the Family Court Enhancer Project, oh my God, mediation and domestic violence, absolutely, right? So the state and the federal are going to move at a different pace. And then, the fact that Upland had a volunteer-run supervised visitation program in there, right? Like, and it was all immigrant women. So, like, what was happening there? But now that we're so formalized, we don't see that many families of South Asian descent in supervised visitation programming, right? So, sort of that I don't know. I find it interesting, and I think that's where I'm hoping. I know one day for myself is the families that do leave supervised visitation. What would community care look like for them? right? That's voluntary. I
Right.
don't know. I don't know. Right?
You know, it's really interesting that if you look at the battered women's movement, it's at some point on some levels it stopped being a movement and became professionalized, you know, and yeah, right. No, people didn't see that. Leslie was saying money, and there was, and on one hand, it was good that it was institutionalized in terms of public monies going into that. But suddenly everybody had to be a social worker, you know, and there couldn't be volunteers. And I mean, you know, the role of volunteers, and that was left behind. And I'm not even saying that some of that shouldn't have been left behind or was a natural kind of, I mean, I'm not, but it was another way of moving away from a sort of a community base. It was, you know, it depended on the community. Sometimes it still was imposed from the outside in some ways. But, you know, and then the judicial and also the funding came more and more for the judicial system. But I mean, I think it's a question of how you build a humane system, I guess.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, it's no different in some ways than any other system, and how you make it centered on the people who are being served by the system and their realities, and not by the profession or the other. I mean, it's just a very different system. You know, very few people who are serving the people in those systems. Maybe that's not, at least in urban areas, not all of them are coming from that community. And I'm not saying all of them should, but I'm just saying it's like we've really become, it's an example of how individualized and atomized everything is, you know, families and individuals.
I am mindful of the time. I don't want to kill off the conversation. I just want to say it is 12:01 and make it official and say thank you, Amrita and Sheila, for taking time. This has been
This is great.
A great presentation. I can't wait to put it up. But this was extremely useful and helpful and fascinating and all those sorts of good things. So thank you for taking the time, and thank you everybody for taking time to join us. I'm going to end the recording now. People can feel free to stay. We won't kick you out quite yet. So
Thank you. Thank you for inviting us. Really appreciate being in the space.